For over a century, going to the pictures has been very much a shared experience. But the golden age of majestic picture palaces, not to mention the inimitable charm of the local flea pit, is for the most part just a fading memory as the old buildings disappear or transform beyond recognition. In 1939, Nottingham boasted 52 individual halls in competition. Now, only 2 of the originals, the Odeon and the Savoy, remain in operation. The decline in attendance can be attributed to a number of factors, not least the invention on which you're watching this very programme, the television. The first time the people of Nottingham were treated to the illusion of moving pictures was at Europe's biggest and best-known travelling fair, the Goose Fair. Thomas Edison's kinetoscope was a relatively crude affair. Because of the design of the machine, only one person could view the images at a time, and the films, which consisted of very basic images, such as a train coming to a station or factory workers leaving work, would run for just over a minute. Caldwell's Gallery on Long Row, adjacent to the then Goose Fair site, Slab Square, was an empty shop, which was converted into a makeshift picture parlour. Several kinetoscope machines were installed, but being little more than an interesting gimmick for solo viewing, the public soon grew tired. Exhibition of moving images to an audience was made possible by the invention of the projector. The Grand Theatre in Hyson Green was one of Nottingham's leading music halls, and it was to become the first local establishment to exploit the new medium, showing a selection of short films at the bottom of a theatrical bill in July 1896.
Trilby, which was a very famous play at the time and had been performed many times by various companies in different theatres. And the Grand had heard about this cinematograph, and they arranged for this to be exhibited. But of course there was no projection room or anything like this, so a screen had to be hastily erected on stage, which was probably little more than a big sheet of hardboard or something, I would think. And the projector had to be put in one of the side boxes and shown at an oblique angle onto the screen. And when a wave rushed towards the camera, this appeared to break over the edge of the stage, and all those that were sat on the front row just promptly lifted their feet up.
The cinematic performance lasted no more than 12 minutes, but it caused a sensation. It was the Palace Theatre on Market Street, later the Scala, then the Classic, which was the first Nottingham establishment to programme an entire evening of filmed entertainment in August 1896. A total of around 50 short films were screened. The fad soon caught on. The public were hypnotised by this novelty which seemed to replicate reality. Music halls and theatres such as the Empire, the Hippodrome, the Mechanics Hall and the Albert Hall began to show films as part of an evening's entertainment. Shops began being converted into picture parlours. One such establishment was the Midland Electric Bioscope on Arkwright Street, which opened in 1908. But conditions in the picture parlours were far from idyllic. People were crammed in like sardines and made to sit on long forms, boxes, or simply the floor. The projector was often located within the auditorium, standing on an old orange box, while the projectionist hand-cranked the film through, which often rolled straight onto the floor. There were no restrictions on smoking, and the film itself was nitrate-based, which was highly flammable. But this didn't bother the proprietors, as the paying public would come in droves. Inevitably, there were numerous disasters all over the country.
It was nitrate film. As soon as the film stopped, up it went round the back of him and shut the light off with such a bang it opened the spool box door because the fire went in the spool box. And the old machine was on fire, spool in the other machine, ready, and that film and the spool box was open, and the fire got round to that. So I got two machines on fire. The door in the operating box was an iron door, and I just got behind that and stood on a ladder, an iron ladder that went down to the next floor. And I stood there and I could hear the roar of the fire inside.
Legislation had to be introduced. The new rules included the necessity to isolate the projection room or box, as it subsequently became known, so that in the event of a fire it could be sealed off, preventing the fire from spreading.
Fortunately, I dropped the shutters between the auditorium and the operating box, and the fire didn't go in there, or the smoke, you see, so the audience knew nothing of it.
In addition, walls and benches had to be lead-lined, while the seats in the auditorium had to be secured to the floor. Fire exits and emergency lighting were also required. The Cinematographic Act of 1909 brought about the end of dangerous and unhealthy film shows. It did, however, pave the way for purpose-built picture houses, designed with a degree of ease and comfort and an emphasis on safety as well as entertainment. Nottingham's first purpose-built cinema was the Victoria Electric on Milton Street, which stood opposite the Victoria Station Clock Tower. It opened in March 1910. And, of course, the art form of cinema began to evolve.
Films started to get longer. People soon got tired of seeing kids playing, waves breaking over beaches and simple little things like that. They wanted stories. They wanted to be entertained. And a lot of the very early films, of course, were comedies. Comedies, of course, appealed to all ages across the board. So not only did they get more inventive, they got longer. And, of course, cinemas became more plentiful, proper cinemas, that is. I mean, the Victoria Electric was very soon followed by others.
With the increased popularity of the movies, a number of picture houses were constructed in and around the city. It wasn't long before a more lavish picture house was required for the city centre. In November 1912, Nottingham's first super cinema was opened. Located on the site where Caldwell's Gallery once amazed fairgoers with kinetoscope images, the Long Row Picture House took the Nottingham cinema to new heights. Aside from the 600-seat auditorium, there was also a restaurant in the building. The cinema had doormen in uniform, and the public would dress up to attend, as a night at the pictures was starting to become an occasion. During the silent era, musical accompaniment was an integral part of the show, and the Long Row Picture House had the biggest orchestra in town.
The early, very small cinemas could only afford something like a piano accompaniment, sometimes augmented by a violin, and perhaps some ingenious sound effects, things of that sort. The bigger and more opulent cinemas, as we got further beyond 1910 and that time of life, they could afford small orchestras, which got bigger and bigger.
Picture palaces, as they rapidly became known, quickly emerged in all districts from Netherfield to Beeston, Arnold to Trent Bridge, and some, like the Electra and the Imperial, were quite substantial. In those days, metal tokens were used for entry instead of tickets. Many establishments couldn't afford a full orchestra, so often a trio would suffice, or even a solo pianist. Sometimes the musicians wouldn't have seen the film before accompanying it, so imaginative improvisation was often necessary. November 1917, the Somme. It was here that Officer Charles Lomax from Bulwell met London architect Lieutenant Jasper Adamson. The two got talking in an effort to divert their minds from the immediate horrors of war and discovered their common interest in cinema. Lomax described an ill-used site on Upper Parliament Street which might be ideal for a super cinema. In 1919, with the war over, Jasper Adamson travelled to Nottingham to visit Lomax and the site. He quickly acquired the ground and planned what was to become the Elite. The construction of the Elite was a massive undertaking, which was often hampered by the caves running underneath the site. Eventually, the caves had to be filled with concrete in order to secure the surface.
Despite the fact that it was a marvellous building, luxury all the way around, the architects, so rumour has it, had actually forgot the projection room in the design when it was virtually finished. Of course, there was frantic manoeuvring around, what are we going to do now? The most important room in the cinema. So what did they do? They had to build it above the kitchen. So we then had to suffer all the smells, particularly in summer, coming from the kitchen.
Despite the mishaps, the completed edifice was a great success. The building boasted an ornate white exterior adorned with statues. The huge frontage concealed lounges, restaurants, a Georgian tea room, the Louis XVI French cafe, a ballroom and a 1,500-seat auditorium. The Elite enjoyed a civic launch on August the 22nd, 1921, opening with the movie Pollyanna, which starred America's sweetheart Mary Pickford. Huge queues snaked around the block all day in an effort to obtain tickets, with many turned away as the last house sold out.
The first organ was in the Elite Cinema, and that was when the cinema opened in 1921. It wasn't a theatre organ as such as we know them. It wasn't a unit organ. It was very much a straight church-type instrument, probably a concert organ, built by the very well-known firm of Henry Willis in partnership with Lewis.
And this is typical with all the different effects and tonal colours. This one has 5 different sets of pipework. I'll just show you. This is the tibia. A string, which is a solitional. A flute. The vox humana, which is a reed. And a tuba horn. Now you can use these in various combinations, and of course you can use them in conjunction with the tonal percussions. And of course you've got some silent picture effects, drum crash, drum tap, fire gong, birds, I think they want a drink, surf, that's the tide coming in, and the steamboat, and a horn. So you can do all the imitations you want to a silent picture.
By the late 20s, the cinema industry had fallen into recession, and many expensive films struggled to turn profits. Something was needed to grab the public's eye, and it came in the shape of the first Oscar winner, Wings. The film starred It Girl Clara Bow amidst an array of sound effects-laden aerial dogfights. The film not only won an Oscar for sound engineering, but also brought in capacity houses and paved the way for the talking picture. It was Warner Brothers who first commercialised Hollywood's latest gimmick with the Al Jolson starrer, The Jazz Singer, which featured his catchphrase, "You ain't heard nothing yet." But it was Jolson's next film, The Singing Fool, which would really set Nottingham audiences alight.
The Singing Fool had arrived in Nottingham, and this opened at the Hippodrome in July 1929, and they played it for 3 weeks to packed houses. Crowds actually packed Theatre Square.
Climb up on my knee, funny boy. Go your only plea, funny boy.
The first showing was actually at the Apollo, but it wasn't a proper paid showing. What happened, it arrived at the Gaumont, which was the Hippodrome. It arrived there late and the cinema was locked up. So, undeterred, the driver drove round to the Apollo at Berridge Road and knocked up the chief projectionist, asked if he would mind taking in the film. He took the film in, and then suddenly realised what he got in his hands, the very first talkie picture. And they'd already been fitted up with the gramophone players. The discs were there, the film was there. So the neighbourhood was knocked up and told that they were going to show the Al Jolson film at midnight. It'd be free. And the cinema was full.
Initially considered a gimmick, the talking picture soon established itself, and exhibitors found that the public preferred talkies to silence, even if the sound was somewhat crude. These early sound films carried their soundtrack on 16-inch discs, while the oil-weighted pickups tracked from the centre outwards and were prone to disasters.
I mean, a good example was the Vernon, on Vernon Road at Baseford. Across the road is, of course, the railway line, and tram cars ran up and down Vernon Road those days as well. So if a tram and a train passed at the same time, the combined vibration set up from these would go into the Vernon building, and the needle tracking in the record would jump and dither about on the surface, and the whole thing would go totally out of sync.
Most of the orchestras then were disbanded. The organists were kept on because in the early days the supporting film, or films, the supporting programme, was usually silent, and so they needed an organist to accompany those. And also the sound in the early days wasn't very reliable, and it very often broke down, so you needed the organist to sort of fill in, and sometimes drown the voices, because the early voices were pretty dreadful.
The public were eager to hear what kind of voices the movie stars had. Some silent actors had no problem adapting to talkies, but those who experienced problems remembering lines, not to mention those with thick accents, stutters or lisps, quickly faded away. The first local cinema purpose-built for talkies was the Tudor in West Bridgford. Its Elizabethan exterior contrasted greatly with its continental interior style. The elaborate design was to mark the beginning of a whole new era in cinema architecture, that of the 30s super cinema.
The heyday of the movie theatre in the States was the 1920s, there's no doubt about that. Our heyday was the 1930s, we were much later, but we copied them, and a thing called atmosphere was very, very strong in the States in the 1920s. The idea was that you would go into the cinema and you would be immediately taken into another world, and you did it by having little buildings and trees and twinkling stars in the sky and clouds moving across the sky from the projection box in the interval. That caught on here to some extent in the late 20s. There's only one that had that atmosphere in Nottingham that I can think of, and that's the Picture House at Apsley, which later became the Commodore. It had a suggestion of atmosphere by low relief decoration, trees and flowers and whatever on the side walls. And then early 30s, of course, Odeons started to arrive, 1933, 1934. Their influence came from Germany, striking modern exteriors outlined in neon, which would show up at night. Everybody else copied Odeon eventually. And the idea was that you should have a simple, straightforward interior with straight lines, everything leading to the screen, a fairly simple stage with perhaps 2 sets of tabs, curtains, and no frills at all.
New super cinemas began to spring up all over Nottingham with striking designs and an emphasis on luxury. At its peak, Nottingham could boast 52 cinemas.
The two principal architects in Nottingham, A.W. Thraves and Reginald Cooper, were obviously influenced by Odeon. They worked together in the same practice to begin with, and apparently Cooper was expecting, I think he was really the kind of shining star of the practice. He was expecting to be made a partner. This didn't happen, so in 1934 he broke away from Thraves, and after that they were very much in competition. And they each designed something of 12 cinemas upwards. They were doing about 2 or 3 a year. Many of Cooper's cinemas in the Nottingham area were of this modern design with a tiled fascia, a fin or a little tower to indicate where the cinema was with the name on it, striking exteriors, and Thraves followed that to some extent.
You know, they'd sit there with the curtains a bit closed, with the nice lights on around the proscenium arch.
The actual starting of the show, I mean, nice dimmed out lights, curtains with coloured lighting on, the curtains open and there's your picture comes on. It's presentation to it. And to keep that film there all the time without having any mistakes or anything was like a profession.
It was like being in the army, discipline. Because we all wore, three page boys wore uniform, 2 doormen wore uniform, exactly the same as we did, or like they did. And at 1:45 every day, all the 10 usherettes, chocolate girl, 3 page boys had to stand in line and be inspected by the chief usherette or the manager.
Some of the older suburban picture houses paled in comparison to the new super cinemas and became affectionately known by the locals as the Flea Pit, the Bug Hutch or the Blood Tub. The Sneinton Palace became the Itch and Scratch, the legend being you went in with a flea and came out with a jumper.
But one of the places I used to love to go to more than anywhere was the Boulevard at Hyson Green, and that was a 100% genuine bug hole, and it was regarded with great affection by the locals as the bug hole. But the thing I remember more than anything was they had a lovely huge cat, and it was there to catch the rodents that abounded in the Boulevard, and the cat sometimes used to walk around and sort of rub against your leg like cats do, and you'd go and give it a little stroke and it'd wander off to another patron. A lovely thing. And one day I was watching the film and the cat decided it would sleep on my foot. And the film came to an end, the lights went on, and I looked down, it was a rat. the rat had crept along and decided this looks a nice place to sleep, and it was curled up. And I nearly had a dicky fit.
The crowning event of the 30s was the arrival of the Ritz on Angel Row. A factory, old houses and shops were demolished in order to allow the building of the new cinema. The narrow frontage was humble compared with some of its contemporaries, but the huge 2,500-seat auditorium was most impressive. It was opened by the Lord Mayor on December the 4th, 1933. The 22-rank conical organ, designed and played on the opening night by Reginald Fore, became an attraction in its own right. Although cinemas such as the Long Row Picture House, the Old and New Empress and the Regent Hall housed church or concert organs, only 3 local establishments had specially installed unit cinema organs. The Ritz was one, the other 2 being the Elite and the Hippodrome. The Elite's original Willis concert organ was replaced in 1930 by a Compton organ, which was opened by Herbert Dowson. The Hippodrome's Wurlitzer was opened in 1927 by Leslie James. None of Nottingham's cinema organs have survived, but in the 30s the live show was very much a part of the evening's entertainment. At the Ritz, it was the resident who arrived within 3 weeks of the cinema's opening who was to become a household name.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jack Hellier.
Jack Hellier, who was resident virtually until 1950. And of course, as we know, Jack Hellier became extremely popular. He was a regular broadcaster. The BBC had a landline to the Ritz.
Quality music, and this is what the public liked.
My father enjoyed music. The fact that he was able to produce this as an entertainment, I think, gave him a lot of pleasure. His own particular preferences were classical, and I think he would have liked to have just had Brahms, Beethoven and Bach, given his own choice. But certainly it gave everybody an insight into music that they may not have gone to, say, the Albert Hall in those days or a symphony concert elsewhere to hear, but they had that opportunity to hear it at the cinema, as well as enjoying themselves, coming to the films twice a week. It was an event that happened for people in those days.
outbreak of war in 1939 stopped all cinema building, and partially developed projects, such as the embassy in Beeston, were abandoned. As blackout conditions were enforced throughout the country, the government called for all centres of entertainment to close. Large auditoriums were considered potential death traps in the face of the expected blitzkrieg. As it happened, fears of immediate attacks from the sky proved unfounded, and local cinema owners called upon the authorities to allow cinemas to reopen. But because of the blackout, the lavish neon exteriors had to remain extinguished.
The Rio was the last cinema to actually open when war was declared in 1939. They'd just finished the Carlton, which is now the ABC, and the Rio was the next on the list. But they actually opened in the blackout, which was a bit of a shame really, because particularly in the Carlton's case, they'd planned to have a big opening like the Ritz did. They wanted all the fanfare, searchlights, visiting VIPs, this kind of thing. But war was declared and down come the hatchet on everything. In fact, the building, the Carlton building, was never completely finished because the area above the ground floor foyer was going to be a restaurant, but it never got completed.
With only the radio at home for entertainment, the populace flocked to the local cinema in record numbers, eager for company and amusement.
When the sirens went at the Cavendish, we used to keep the audience in the cinema until the all clear went. We also had 2 feature films stored in a little storeroom we had, right? And then after the main show had finished, we used to get the films out from the storeroom and give them an extra treat. We showed them another feature film or something like that.
People would get up and entertain. And I've heard a lot of stories from people who were in management those days about locals getting up on the stage and doing turns or whatever.
So I got the sax in the projection room and left it there in case it was needed. Sirens had gone and we could hear things going around. And so he said, right, Ted, it's time for the show. You know, get your sax. And he'd go down, I'd go on the stage and Phil would dress up as a vicar. He had all his props around him, you know. And he'd go onto the stage and he'd do his sketch and I'd play a couple of popular numbers and get them all singing to the popular tunes of the day.
And it was basically because people felt that they was contributing something. It helped to boost the morale and keep things going, because the blackout really was a grim time.
The cinema not only provided an escape from the harsh reality of war, it also became a practical arena for many recruitment drives. Despite the all-time record attendances during the war, Nottingham managed to lose 5 cinemas. The Plaza, the Kinema, the Regent's Hall, the Goldsmith Street Picture House, and the Palace, Sneinton. None of the closures were due to enemy action. Since 1936, the exhibition of material aimed at children had been steadily growing. The weekly Saturday Kids Show had become firmly established by 1947.
And whole armies of kids would turn up on Saturdays and fight to get in, fight over where they wanted to sit, fight to get out again.
But there used to be about 300 children in the morning, and the cleaners we used to pay the cleaners to actually control them as near as you could, and they used to have dustbin lids and bang them together to try and get them to shut up before the show started.
Well, I had some experiences at the Palladium. We used to have a Saturday matinee, kids matinee. Now we're talking about 1938, 39 or maybe earlier. These films were silent films for the kids on a Saturday afternoon, and they were in an atrocious condition. You didn't even know what reel numbers you were using. You had one with a title on it, you had one with an end on it, and then you'd have 2 or 3 in between with real numbers on, but sometimes you'd have a couple of reels with no numbers on. The cowboy films that we showed, there would be somebody killed in the film, and then the next reel, he'd be riding the horses, see, because the reels were the wrong way round. kids were screaming the laughter, you know, and they were really enjoying this. And sometimes I felt, well, the best films we can show is films that come in with reels with no numbers.
I started the first children's club, which we called Miners at Matinees, and I used to get 1,000, and I was Uncle Bert to them. But before I went on the stage, I used to be in the foyer and treat them, not look down and talk to them, and used to bring to me all the troubles that was homeless, and I used to listen to them, sympathise them. And I mean, I used to go to my office just before I went on stage, my pockets were full of sweets. They always brought me sweets, treacle topping, all sorts of things like that. Goose gobs, humbugs, all sorts of things.
Well, they used to start off with a sing-song that puts a film on with words on the bottom, you know, all popular for the children.
Then I used to go on stage and we used to have a sing-song, the Miners song. And then I used to run fancy dress competitions, have them on the stage, things like that. Anything to gain the interest of the children.
And then they'd start off with a film, there'd be a film about 60 minutes of cowboy, western, Roy Rogers perhaps, or Gene Orr singing cowboy, you know.
To have some background music, we used to have records. We used to put records on accompanying the film. You get one of these films of the heroines die, all very sad, and there'd be a Tommy Dorsey record belting out full swing. And likewise, if there was Indians running all over the screen and so, we'd be playing some violin solo or something like this. I mean, it's totally chaotic.
And then they'd have a few cartoons, perhaps a couple of cartoons, Tom and Jerry, Mickey Mouse and Goofy, all those sort of things, and finish up with a serial.
It didn't matter if you felt ill all week. You might be too ill to go to school, even on a Friday, too badly to go to school. But come Saturday, back came all your fortitude and strength, and nothing would stop you going to the local picture house to see, you know, the serial, you know. I mean, this week, Chapter 9, you know, The Crushing Walls, you know, I mean, no self-respecting kid would go and miss that.
Nobody, none of the major circuits would book this film. It was called The Lone Ranger in the City of Gold. And a chap called Rains, Bernard Rains, he was a manager with a lot of flair, and he booked the film, but he also booked the Lone Ranger in person, who was over in London doing personal appearances. And well, St Answell Road at that time was just a sea of children.
It would end at some really exciting moment, and as soon as the words continued next week blazed across the screen, there would be this terrific stampede for the exits. All the doors would fly open and kids would swarm out all over the road and block traffic.
Let the flood out sort of thing till the following week.
The Children's Film Foundation was started by J. Arthur Rank in 1944 and would continue for another 30 years.
The idea was that they were your customers of the future. So if you could get them to come along on Saturday mornings, and as they grow up, they'd come along in the evenings.
And a lot of these people will now remember me to this day, you know, because a lot of these children now adults and got families. But I used to enjoy that part of the job because I've been a kid myself.
The decline of the cinema was helped along by the advent of television. The coronation of June 1953 boosted TV sales, and it was rapidly becoming a standard feature in the home. Locally, cinema attendances fell by 8 million from the all-time high of 1940.
But they were falling because lack of attendance, because the television was attracting more people now, and the cinemas were suffering badly for it. And don't forget, there was an awful lot of cinemas in Nottingham, an awful lot. And to expect those to remain filled or even half filled when they got the attraction of television coming along was too much to expect.
I think it was the novelty, and people thought, well, why bother? Why walk down the road? It's raining. It's going to cost us. And they stopped at home.
Well, of course, television did a lot of harm. And I think the cinemas themselves harmed it, because the standard of films fell. a lot of B-type movies and that sort of thing. Of course, people didn't want that. They were seeing better stuff on the television.
The Hollywood studios had to come up with some inventive ideas in order to lure that custom.
When the 3D came in '53, people remember Lying in Your Lap, Born a Devil, all that rubbish.
A lot of the producers stuck 3D in as a gimmick instead of making a good film to start with. Had they have made like André de Toth did with House of Wax, if the film was good on its own, it would stand on its own. 3D just made it better. But rubbish is rubbish. And it's no good sticking 3D into it and expecting it to take money, because the public will soon see through that and say, well, the 3D is good, but the film's tripe. And so it would sink. And in no time at all, of course, the spotlight shifted from 3D to CinemaScope, which was Fox's answer to declining audiences. But of course, a lot of the cinemas that were built in the 30s didn't have the provision for wider screens without knocking the proscenium down and rebuilding. And if they didn't want to go to that expense, then they had to resort to bringing the top of the picture down and compressing the image into a little letterbox slot, which looked horrible.
While the CinemaScope format is still with us, other gimmicks were less successful.
When I did arrive at the Scala, the first gimmick, if you like, that we put through there was Flying Skeleton, which we called Emergo. And the idea behind that was that as a body is lifted out of a vat on screen, the skeleton that's dangling up on the wires float out above the audience's heads. And like all ideas in theory, it sounds good. The first few nights it went through, I don't think people really understood much about it. They just sort of sat there and watched this eerie thing glide up the cinemas.
The skeleton that floated above the audience's head, that was great fun, because it would just come trundling past you on its ropes and pulleys, jerking along, and of course it would pass you and come right up to the front of the balcony.
But then, of course, the word went around, and come the weekend, all the boys were in there armed to the teeth with everything, all sorts of missiles you could think of. And this thing would get about 2/3 of the way up the cinema, and someone would shout, "Now!"
And poor old Emergo was pelted with ice cream cartons, drink cans, everything, every appearance. It was great fun.
It was intended to be scary. We ended up with the best comedy in town, you know. I mean, and for 2 weeks we had to sit there with this thing, you know, 4 times a day for 2 weeks. But we got our own back on the people of Nottingham for doing that, for taking it out on our skeleton, because a few weeks later we ran a film called The Tingler, and that involved wiring the seats up to give people electric shocks. Come the first electrocution on screen, you know, throw the switch, you see. And if you look closely, all peering out the windows like this, you know, at the audience, you'd see them all jump like that, you know. And you think, look at that over there.
The burden of the entertainment tax brought about the closure of several local houses, among them the Boulevard, the Curzon, the Imperial and the News House. The tax had been lifted from theatres and concert halls, and by the early 50s, cinemas were the only places of entertainment which continued to be levied.
At that time, entertainment tax was still levied on cinema admissions, but the cinemas discovered that if a third of the programme was live, and they advertised the fact, they got away without paying any entertainment tax until 1960, when it suddenly came off.
In 1955, the Victorian game of Lotto reappeared disguised as bingo, and cinemas were considered ideal venues for the new craze, further driving a nail into the coffin of film exhibition. The Boulevard was the first to convert. Initially, by law, cash prizes were not permitted, but this changed with the Betting and Gaming Act of 1959, which became the linchpin to a dozen more cinema to bingo hall conversions in the 60s.
There will now be a short intermission. From The Girl with the Tray. For your further pleasure, confectionery and cigarettes are available at the kiosk.
The sweets, etc., were cheap.
Fresh strawberries, crushed and taken to the heart of earth.
So you could get an ice cream for 3pence or 6pence, and the drink similar. You can get a lolly on a stick for a penny or 2pence.
The ice cold bricks on a stick.
Of the city's remaining cinemas, a number had to move over to the kind of entertainment that the television couldn't offer. Both the New Victoria, later the Moulin Rouge, and the Scala became homes for the continental film. Along with these acclaimed European productions came the occasional risque offering. In November 1964, Cinerama came to the Forest for 3 months. The process required 3 35mm projectors which united the pictures on a giant curved screen. The Forest will play host to Cinerama for 2 more 3-month seasons in the following years before the elaborate process was abandoned. The Nottingham Film Theatre, Broad Street, first opened its doors to the public in 1966, having hitherto been a private film and photographic club. Today it functions as the Broadway, a highly respected multimedia centre which hosts Nottingham's annual crime and mystery festival, Shots in the Dark. For the bigger cinemas, it was evident that drastic new measures had to be taken to attract numbers.
In 1964, I heard the Beatles were coming live to the Odeon. It was just, every aisle was covered with policemen. I mean, I've never seen so many policemen in all my life. Just from one end of the cinema to the other end, downstairs this was. So they couldn't rush the stage. And the screaming was just absolutely horrendous. And I thought, well, what better way to meet them than to go and work there. I got myself a job as 3rd cashier just before it closed.
The Nottingham Odeon daringly became the pioneer of the future of cinema as we know it.
The year is 1965 and the place is Nottingham. Here in Angel Row, the ancient city adds yet another new building to its ever-changing skyline. For here, the Odeon Twin Theatres are opened, an entertainment centre consisting of 2 cinemas, not one, and a variety of services for leisure. The Odeon Twins are unique, the latest and most advanced example of cinema design in Britain. Almost everything about it is automated, but it will never lose the personal touch symbolized in the figure of its manager, ever ready to meet the people he serves. At once, we see this is not only one cinema, or even 2 cinemas. It's a meeting place, a rendezvous, with an elaborate restaurant and private catering facilities, where the people of Nottingham can get exactly the sort of meal they feel in the mood for, at exactly the time they want it. A full meal, a grill, a snack. The range is wide and the chefs are expert. There is even a licensed bar, a great rarity in a cinema in this country. And in the Corolla restaurant, of course, everything is done to see that people enjoy themselves. Meanwhile, the kiosk in the foyer makes a handy shopping place. But of course, the twin-deck cinemas will always be the Odeon's star attraction. The building cost a full £250,000, and the equipment is the most advanced in the world. The projection box is the bridge or nerve center whose electronic brain controls scores of different operations throughout the whole building. Most of them come together in the immensely complicated circuits of the control console, an instrument that can be instructed to do seemingly anything in a theater. Orders are issued to it, its program is set, and it carries out 100 instructions automatically. Aided by a radio link-up, an engineer can study the sound level of the film and its focus and feedback instructions. He can check the temperature in various parts of the building and again instruct the Cinemation control console in the projection room. Cinemation? It's the last word in electronic theatre control. It seems to do everything. Banks of transistor circuits look after the separate tracks of a stereophonic sound film, enabling the sound to come from different parts of the auditorium. A separate panel reports automatically from the other box projecting for the other theatre. But of course, despite the electronic marvels, the film's the thing, and the projectors themselves are vital. Without their smooth running, the show just can't go on. They will be in operation hour after hour, day after day, year after year. So the film is ready. The curtains whisper back. In the box, the arc is struck, the screen widens out. And so for Britain, with Nottingham leading the way, begins a new era in the story of the cinema.
This was the world's first fully automated cinema, built in 1965, and this auditorium is as it was in 1965, opening with the film Sound of Music, which showed for 2.5 years. Also, number 2 downstairs, that was the 1400-seater.
Most of Nottingham cinemas were already out of business. Between 1954 and 1964, 30 cinemas closed their doors for the last time. Because of their unusual shape, the sloping floors, the vast amounts of disused space, not to mention the cost of maintenance and upkeep, many cinemas were worth more as flat land than as grandiose, unusable buildings. Nottingham's first purpose-built cinema, the Victoria Electric, ended its days as the Moulin Rouge, showing adult films. It was demolished in the early 70s as part of the new development of the entire block.
January the 1st, 1971, and I was absolutely devastated. They put in a call and said we're closing it, and they closed it at the end of January. Most of the staff had been there years. They were absolutely, they couldn't believe it. Everyone was just completely silent. They just didn't know what to say. And within a couple of weeks or so, they bulldozed the whole site. The support we got from the local people was unbelievable. There wasn't anything we could do.
One by one, they disappeared. Had they have gone twin or triple, maybe they still would be open today. It's difficult to say.
Some of the buildings did manage to become useful in their original shape. Others had the balcony extended, the ground floor flattened, and were transformed into large 2- or 3-story buildings. The inevitable triple complex arrived in the 70s. 3 cinemas in one, with the former balcony area now becoming the main theatre and the ground floors providing twin cines of varying capacities. The carving up of original auditoriums would not stop there, but the public perception of a night at the cinema has changed over the years. In 1989, England's first National Amusements Showcase cinema opened on Lenton Boulevard to mixed reaction. The multiplex was an idea which emanated from the USA, and with 11 screens on one level, rocking chair seats and massive foyer, the showcase was the ultimate in the new cinema experience. 2 more screens were later added, totalling 13 and catering for 3,200 people.
You go into the cinema and sit down now, and all you see is a big blank white screen. They show you a few slides of adverts. They start the film. When that's finished, you've had it. There's no showmanship to it now. I saw the manager, and he took me into the operating box, and there was about 10 machines all running showing pictures. There was nobody about.
It was inevitable. It happened in the States. It was bound to come over here.
In the modern multi-cinemas, you just go in there, there's a room, you sit down, there's a screen there, and that's as far as you go until you've seen the film.
The idea of the multiplex is good. People have got 12 choices basically at that one venue. They just go there, they walk in, they've got the choice of 12 auditoriums. There's got to be something out of that lot that appeals to them.
The whole attitude of the city centre cinemas changed. Then the audience changed, the profile changed. It was now mainly students and families and those people who couldn't get to Showcase. And we were a little worried at the time that we weren't going to survive. But as it's turned out, with the promotion that Showcase had put in, there's more people going to the cinema, and we've taken the benefit from it.
It was expected that the home video boom of the early 80s and the introduction of the multiplex would starve Nottingham's remaining cinemas of custom. Contrarily, the nearby Savoy fought back by upgrading and adding a 4th screen, and has since prospered. The Odeon introduced more in-house amenities and now has 6 screens. The Broadway opened its media centre, twin cinema and online facilities, whilst the Byron in Hucknall still has 1 screen, but reserves downstairs for bingo.
So every little bit of space that we have has been turned into a cinema to cope with the modern day developments. I think it's part of a night out. Traditionally, if you go back to when I first started in this business, you would have 2 films, so you'd have a look at life, and it was the night out. It took your whole night. Now people can go and enjoy a meal, they can go to a club or a pub afterwards and spend 2 hours at the cinema. And it's a sense of occasion. Films are much better now. I mean, with digital stereo, you know, the presentation on the screen is absolutely superb, and people expect that, and they should get it.
Nottingham's ex-cinemas are still in remarkable condition and have been listed as interesting buildings. The Capitol in Radford, which ceased operating as a cinema in 1968, is still used as a bingo hall.
Sitting here, yeah, I think, you know, it's, I can't believe it's what, it must be 25 years since I was here. But it is sad because it's a beautiful place, been well preserved. Lovely, yeah.
The Elite is once more commanding the news. It was proposed for demolition in 1972, but these plans never materialised, and the building continued operating as a cinema until 1977, before converting to bingo. The building is currently undergoing extensive work for reopening as a Big Beat nightclub split over 2 levels, but because of its listed status, the work is not damaging what remains of the original interior. Therefore, sometime in the future, it would be possible to restore the Elite to an authentic 20s cinema. house that ABC built 60 years ago became the latest casualty on a closure list already overlong. As the Carlton, it was once one of the city's leading lights and played host to several film stars arriving to crowds who on occasion blocked Chapel Bar. As the 20th century drew to a close and exciting bold developments were unveiled for the millennium, work was already underway on the Warner Village complex on Foreman Street, with 16 luxury screens, bars, cafes and restaurants. From its humble beginnings, exhibition of moving pictures has evolved and will continue to do so into the future. However, one thing is certain, Nottingham's ongoing love affair with the cinema is unlikely to subside.